Great. Thank you all again. I want to talk a little bit about New Borders and Byte before I hand it off to our main speakers. As I'm sure many of you on this call are aware, international sanctions and trade compliance requirements have become increasingly complex, especially as more trade defense policies are implemented. Strategic trade controls have only gotten stricter after the invasion of Ukraine, with new sanctions emerging pretty much on a near daily basis, especially with forced labor regulations coming out for China. Here at New Borders, we do two things. We have a back-end AI-based trade data platform with hundreds of millions of records that informs our analysis and drives our compliance and risk management tools. We take the output of the AI model and consolidate that larger list of compliance data and make it all available to the public through a very easy to use web app that we'll kind of get through and we'll show you some updates for you on that application. The web app, known as Byte, offers a cost-effective toolbox for trade and transaction compliance via the web app. We provide a low-cost, efficient way for customers to mitigate their trade risk. The app allows customers to check shipments and transactions for entities or commodities that are sanctioned, watchlist, or require licenses. Entities and commodities are equally important, so we've included them both in there. Byte also helps kind of reduce the workload for import and export compliance. It's a one-stop shop to check across multiple watchlist trade enforcement regimes and second and third tier relationships with watchlist entities. So that's kind of just like a basic overview of kind of what we do here at New Borders and what Byte is. But for today, I want to introduce our speakers who will be discussing their investigative analysis of sensitive technology trade between China and Russia. So we have investigative subject matter expert Michael Ronayne.
Morning.
And from the Siracusa International Institute for Criminal Justice and Human Rights, we have Tobias Freeman.
Hi there.
Okay, so I will turn it over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Eric. So as we said, today we'll be discussing Chinese companies involved in trade with Russia in support of the war in Ukraine, and also our collaborative work with Tobias and the Siracusa International Institute on Chinese entities recently proposed for designation by the European Union. By way of background and for some context, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, the United States has developed more comprehensive sanctions packages targeting Russia, focusing on financial institutions, as well as the military, industrial, and energy sectors. The trade restrictions and economic sanctions enacted to limit Russia's war efforts in Ukraine have also been implemented by the European Union, as well as other countries around the globe, such as Australia, Japan, Canada, New Zealand, and Switzerland, to name just a few. New Borders analysts, utilizing our Byte platform and subject matter experts, reviewed the trade patterns of the Chinese companies reportedly being considered for the designation by the European Union. Now, our analysis was predicated upon our work with Siracusa Institute and with the focus on a May 7th article in the Financial Times reporting the European Union planned on imposing sanctions targeting Chinese companies alleged to be selling defense items to Russia. Now, the list of companies that was proposed in the article included 3 Chinese companies that were already sanctioned by the US. Sino Electronics was sanctioned by OFAC and BIS in 2022, and we'll talk a little bit more about Sino in a few minutes. Asia Pacific Links was sanctioned by OFAC in May of 2023, and 3HC Semiconductors was sanctioned by BIS and added to the entity list just a couple months ago in April of 2023. In addition to those 3 companies also named in the article and proposed for designation were Sigma Technology, King Pi Technology, Tordan Industry, and Alpha Trading Investments. Now, the final decision by the EU only included the designation of Asia Pacific Links, Tordan Industry, and Alpha Trading, and Tobias will discuss that in a minute, but we will show you what the trade looks like and show you analysis here very shortly. But before I delve into the analysis, I'd like to pass this over to Tobias for his take on these entities.
Thanks a lot, Mike. And many thanks to New Borders for the invite to participate in this webinar, and more generally for the dynamic collaboration we've been proud to be part of for the last few years. As Mike said, my name is Tobias Freeman, and I'm a senior lawyer at the Siracusa Institute, which is based in Sicily. And among other topics, we provide technical assistance to post-conflict states, as well as training and capacity building on the international law aspects of countering transnational crime. We also carry out legal and policy research, including in partnership with New Borders, and that's what I'll be discussing today. This partnership has given us new insight for sure into the power of connecting the dots between different sources of information, especially with a data-rich analytical platform specifically designed to target violations of strategic trade controls as well as sanctions regimes. Today, I'll just be providing a little brief context on recent developments for the EU's sanctions regime against Russia. And in that regard, on the 23rd of June this year, the Council of the European Union adopted its 11th package of economic and individual restrictive measures, EU parlance for targeted sanctions in a nutshell, in connection to Russia's ongoing aggression as well as its unlawful annexation and occupation of Ukrainian territory. There are a few interesting aspects about this package in particular. I'll focus on a couple. So this package includes new targeted sanctions against individuals and entities, as well as an expansion of the restrictions on the sale, export, and now also transit of certain goods and technology, as well as additional measures to prevent circumvention of the regime. For example, the new package targets so-called shadow entities from Russia, as well as third countries that intentionally circumvent EU sanctions. So it's this EU perspective that we've tried to contribute to New Borders work. The EU has also assessed that so far, exports of prohibited EU goods to Russia via third countries have undermined the effectiveness of their measures. So that means that sensitive products and technologies continue to be sold to Russia through states such as Armenia, Kazakhstan, Turkey, and China, among others. So to address this loophole, the EU is now able to restrict the sale and export of sanctioned goods and technology to countries that are, quote, at continued and particularly high risk of being used for circumvention for the benefit of Russia. A bit of a mouthful, but in a nutshell, the net has been widened from the EU's perspective. It's in this context that the institute that I represent, the Siracusa Institute and New Borders, have taken a closer look at a range of Chinese entities being considered for listing. So I'll talk a bit about that now. Of course, Michael's already provided a lot of context on the work we've done. But specifically, as part of Annex 4 to the relevant EU regulation, and for the first time, 3 Chinese companies have been listed due to a, quote, key enabling role in supplying electronic components for use by Russia's military. Also included in that context are companies from the United Arab Emirates, Uzbekistan, Syria, and Iran. As Michael mentioned, several other Chinese companies were reportedly considered for inclusion in the 11th package of sanctions measures, but they were not, in fact, sanctioned this time. Nevertheless, we took the opportunity to take a closer look at their activities too, based on open source information. By taking sanctions lists as a starting point, open source research has been one of the key strategies for uncovering new leads for further investigation. In addition to sanctions lists and related reporting, our research has also looked into reports by the UN and other international actors, non-government organizations, as well as, crucially, media reports. This research has pointed to one of the key challenges for the effectiveness of international sanctions. That is the frequent mismatch and non-alignment between different sanctions lists, depending on the jurisdiction in question. And these lists are obviously regularly updated and sometimes highly politicized, including in the EU context. This is where we see Byte's data repository and analytical capability as coming to the fore in generating a valuable snapshot of all the related trade transactions. And as new entities have become of interest, these too can be analyzed through the Byte platform. I'll hand back to you, Michael. Thank you again.
Thank you, Tobias. Much appreciated. So, as Tobias said, we took a closer look at the 7 entities that we originally looked at. And again, only 3 of them were actually designated by the EU, but we thought it would be important to look at the totality of the trade for these 7 companies. So, utilizing the information that Siracusa Institute provided, we executed queries in the Byte platform designed to identify Russian-based trade transactions related to the 7 proposed Chinese entities. And the results of the query showed significant trade. Each Chinese company was identified in the Byte platform as having numerous trade transactions with Russia, including Russian businesses already designated by the US. More specifically, between January of 2021 and December of 2022, the 7 companies were responsible for over 5,800 Russian imports to over 100 consignees with an aggregate value over $26 million $26 million US dollars. Over 1,800 of those transactions were also flagged as dual use items by a customized filter in Byte based on a list of harmonized system codes. Now, to go a little further into the analysis, the most frequent HS codes listed in these trade transactions were in Chapter 39, which is plastics and articles thereof, Chapter 84, nuclear reactors, boilers, machinery and mechanical appliances and parts thereof, and Chapter 85, electrical machinery and equipment and parts thereof. Now, also noteworthy was the fact that multiple US brand names were identified in the transactions. And this is not to say that any of these companies were complicit in this trade or any of these transactions, but it is very important to note and to identify the fact that US commodities are ending up in Russia post-sanctions in the hands of designated entities working in the war effort to support the war effort against Ukraine, So as a US company, we must be aware of the fact that trade of US goods, such as electronics to Russia, a heavily sanctioned destination, likely to be in violation of the very least OFAC violations. And if the commodities themselves are controlled for export from the US, violations of the Department of Commerce and Department of State regulations could also apply. And just as a reminder, as we've discussed on our last call, export violations can carry penalties up to 20 years imprisonment and up to $1 million in fines. So next, we're going to talk about Sino Electronics. So Sino Electronics was one of the companies that was proposed by the EU for designation. They were not one of the 3 that ended up being listed. However, in New Borders, we've seen many transactions with Sino Electronics. So we wanted to give a quick, brief look at what Sino is doing and sort of an analysis of how we broke this down. So Sino Electronics Company Limited is a Chinese company operating since 2006 with multiple locations in China and 1 in Lithuania, which provides electronics components to an international market. Sino's website describes their business, stating in part, "We focus on representing leading manufacturers for broad line products, semiconductor, passive component, LED lighting, electromechanical components, etc." On June 28, 2022, Sino Electronics and their locations in both China and Lithuania were added to the US Department of Commerce Bureau of Industry and Security entity list. Subsequently, on September 30th, 2022, Sino Electronics was again designated, this time by the US Department of Treasury, Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, for their continuing support of Russia, and more specifically for their link to Radio Avtomatika, another sanctioned Russian company, who, according to OFAC, specializes in procuring foreign items for Russia's defense industry. Based on these designations, The European proposal for designation and multiple open source articles identifying Sino as a company assisting Russia's electronic procurement efforts, we conducted a data analysis in Byte to get a clearer picture of Sino trade activity with Russia. So between October 30th of 2021 and November 24th of 2022, Byte identified over 2,800 transactions for Sino Electronics. Now, of those 2,800 transactions, over 2,500 were Russian imports valuing almost $4 million US. Now, as expected, the vast majority of those imports were classified under HS Chapter 85, electrical machinery, and the most prominent consignee receiving 1,168 shipments was Ural Telecom Systems. However, Byte also identified transactions with 5 additional Russian companies sanctioned by the US. And those companies are Vest-Ost or West-Ost, Microson, LLC Spetsvoltage, NovaStream Limited, and SMT iLogic. You know, the next slide, please, Eric. Now, also of note, five companies identified in trade with Sino who could potentially be part of a procurement network for Russian military and defense-related industries. And these 5 companies, all Russian, trading with Sino, were identified as Ultra Beta, Ural Telecom Systems, Radio TechSnob, Atoma, and LLC Microson. So these 5 companies are not currently sanctioned by the US, but they're now concluded in our proprietary Byte list, which is developed by strategic trade control subject matter experts and data scientists. And the list expands regularly based on findings like these, where we essentially show second and third tier relationships in trade to designated entities. Now, in addition, many US brands were identified in the imports, and they were destined for 62 separate consignees. Now, also of note, back to the Byte list just for one second, as we build out the Byte list, we've noticed that some of the entities that we've identified and placed on the Byte list have subsequently been designated by the United States. And again, many US brands were found in these transactions to 62 separate consignees. So critical again to ensure that US technology is not winding up in the hands of Russia. So that's a brief summary of Sino. It would appear that Byte verified the reporting that we received in the open source and also illuminated the fact that Sino is in fact working with many Russian sanctioned entities. Eric, I'll pass it over to Ann now for the product update.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Tobias. Ann, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Eric. And I just want to make sure that everyone can get in and see the app and see the updates live. So I will take over screen share from you now, just for a moment. Great. So Eric went through the intro to Byte at the beginning, so I won't go through that again. Just as a reminder, though, Byte is a cost-effective trade and transaction compliance toolbox. So we've just heard from both Mike and Tobias that there are, watch lists constantly being updated, and we want this to be live and active in our app. So the Byte watch list here is a module that contains numerous international watch lists. Users can search over 47,000 entities. This number is changing regularly, daily, depending on the new entities that are added, as just described. So in the last month, we have automated the EU screening list so that as the EU updates its list, that is reflected automatically in the Byte app. We have also added 2 new lists. So we have added Lithuanian Financial Crimes Investigation Service list, and also the Swiss SECO, so the State Secretariat for Economic Affairs. So these are both financial related lists, and they are now present in the watch list. We also have been updating our Byte list module. So in addition to the Byte list updates that Mike just described, We added 45 entries to the byte list, and we've also added politically exposed persons. So there are now over 300,000 PEPs listed and searchable in the byte list. So the byte list is a searchable list and a collection of entities that has been identified across millions of trade records and other open source data, as just described. And this provides companies with the ability to search across second and third tier relationships and screen for illicit trade networks. So we're very excited about the updates to that byte list. Finally, trade protection. So this module allows you to navigate multiple regimes and multiple agencies to show if a commodity is licensable or possibly dual use. Also, if items are related to forced labor. So new lists within our trade protection module include the Australia group list and critical and emerging technologies list. So those are both now in the app. And there we go. We can take a look at that here. So we can start to see what is included on that Australia group list. Also very exciting, we have a whole new module, the Byte Cyber Protection module, and this allows users to search known exploited vulnerabilities in various software and also search against IP addresses of embargoed countries. So we have ingested over 13 million IP addresses. So you can search by country or across all embargoed countries to make sure that any transactions that you're doing with specific IP addresses, that those IP addresses are not in embargoed countries. We've seen examples of software as a service providers getting strict penalties, heavy penalties after transacting in some of these embargoed countries. So that is an additional product update, and we will be building that out as well. Also coming soon is going to be the API integration, and this will provide easy access to all the data that's in the app currently and that we'll be adding on an ongoing basis. So those are our product updates for the month, and there will be more to come next month.
Thank you, Anne. Much appreciated. Just a reminder to all of our participants, if you do have any questions for Mike or Tobias or Anne, feel free to send me a message in the chat and we will get to those at the end of the call. But we here at New Borders, we really think it's necessary to provide Byte at a cost-effective price point because enforcement is increasing regularly, and many companies of all different sizes are becoming unwitting targets of procurement networks, and they may not be able to invest in many of the higher cost tools that are currently on the market. To kind of give you a better idea of the most recent enforcement actions, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike.
Thanks, Eric. So to close out each meeting, we typically will run through the trade enforcement roundup, where we just talk about different things that are happening in trade enforcement and recently. So the first item is the Department of Treasury OFAC sanctioned Swedbank and Latvia, which is headquartered in Riga, Latvia, and agreed to remit over $3 million to settle a penalty for potential civil liability of violations of OFAC sanctions on Crimea. In addition, on July 10, 2023, the United States Department of Justice announced the indictment of Gail Luft, a dual U.S. and Israeli citizen, for violations of multiple federal statutes, including conspiracy to violate the Foreign Agents Registration Act, well, more commonly referred to as FARA, and multiple counts of violating the Arms Export Control Act. Now, Luft is alleged to have worked while within the United States to advance Chinese interests without registering as a foreign agent and brokering arms deals without the requisite license. On June 23, 2022, the United States Department of Justice announced the sentencing of a former member of the U.S. military to 27 months in prison of conspiracy to violate the Arms Export Control Act. Igor Panchernikov, who formerly served in the U.S. Air Force Reserves, pleaded guilty in March to conspiracy to violate the Arms Export Control Act for his role in receiving controlled defense items such as weapon sights, night vision goggles, from sellers in the US and subsequently exporting them to Russia without the State Department license. Panchnernikov also mailed controlled items to Elena Sheffrin of Illinois, who then exported those items to Russia. Sheffrin has also pleaded guilty and awaits sentencing. 2 other individuals charged in this case are currently fugitives. And then finally, on June 27th, the U.S. Department of Treasury, Office of Foreign Assets Control, designated 1 individual and 4 companies for their association with the Wagner Group, a violent private military group owned by Russian oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was also sanctioned individually by the United States. Now, Wagner was previously designated by OFAC in June of 2017 and by the Department of State in November of 2022. Wagner is also sanctioned by multiple countries around the world. The announcement in June named Andrei Nikolaevich Ivanov, identified as an executive of Wagner Group and 4 companies: Midas Resources, Diamville SAU, Industrial Resources General Trading, and Limited Liability Company DM, who operate in illicit gold dealings that have been used to fund the Wagner Group.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Much appreciated. Last call for any questions. Feel free to put them in the chat before we wrap up. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, I'm going to wrap up today's discussion by just thanking everyone for joining us. If you're interested in learning more about the Byte platform, please feel free to visit our website at www.bytedata.io. I've included this link in the chat, so feel free to head over there and get some more information. You can always schedule a demo with us as well there if you want to have a more in-depth conversation about our platform. But with that, thank you all again, and we look forward to speaking with you all soon. And thank you to our speakers.
Thanks very much, Eric. Bye-bye.